Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Tell us in the comments what time it is for you right now and where in the world you're listening from. We love knowing where our sleepy history travels reach. If you find these long, quiet documentaries help you drift off at night, don't forget to subscribe. It's the best way to support the channel and never miss the next story. Asterisk, the city of Warsaw, before the war, was alive with the rhythms of ordinary European life. Streets hummed with the movement of trams, the chatter of workers on their way to factories, and the steady clinking of glasses in the city's cafes. It was a city where Jewish culture flourished alongside Polish traditions, where Yiddish theaters filled with laughter, and where synagogues stood beside Catholic churches. By 1939, however, this world was already under threat. When the Germans invaded Poland, everything began to collapse. Within months, Jewish residents were stripped of rights, forbidden from owning businesses, barred from entering parks, and eventually forced into what became known as ghettos. The Warsaw Ghetto, established in November 1940, became the largest of these confined spaces. It was a forced enclosure, not a spontaneous neighborhood. German authorities ordered the construction of walls over 3 meters high, topped with barbed wire and broken glass. For those trapped inside, the city transformed into a prison. Some 400,000, just nearly 1/3 of Warsaw's population, were forced into just 1.3 square miles of space. That density meant more than 7 people for every single room. Life inside the ghetto was marked by shortages, regulations, and the stripping away of human dignity through bureaucratic means. Food became the central obsession. Official rations, allotted to Jews by German authorities, provided only about 200 calories per day. Bread made of sawdust, thin soups with almost no vegetables, and occasional smuggled potatoes sustained life. Malnutrition was everywhere, and with it came diseases like typhus, which spread rapidly in overcrowded conditions. For ordinary people, survival meant adapting. Families dismantled furniture for firewood during the winter. Children risked their lives crawling through sewer openings or holes in the wall to smuggle food from the outside. These children became lifelines for their families, yet, if caught, they faced immediate execution. The ghetto was not only a physical space, but also a world of paperwork. Each resident needed identification cards, work permits, and ration coupons. Documents could mean the difference between starvation and survival, between deportation and delay. German officials, along with the Judenrat, the Jewish council imposed by the occupiers, regulated every aspect of life, down to housing assignments and labor lists. The bureaucratic machinery of the Holocaust was visible even in the smallest details: ink stamps, rubber seals, and endless ledgers. And yet, within these walls, life continued in ways that resisted despair. Schools, though illegal, were conducted in secret apartments. Teachers risked their lives to teach mathematics, literature, and history. Cultural life did not vanish either. Musicians played in hidden rooms, writers scribbled notes for future publication, and religious leaders tried to hold services whenever possible. There was a quiet defiance in maintaining normalcy. At the same time, tragedy was constant. Every day brought funerals, though even burial became a challenge. Cemeteries filled quickly, and families struggled to afford a proper resting place. Many bodies went unburied for days due to lack of resources. Children grew up surrounded by death, their play interrupted by funeral processions. The contrast was jarring. Moments of culture, learning, and even laughter set against a backdrop of hunger, disease, and mass suffering. The ghetto became a place where the best and worst of humanity coexisted side by side. The German presence was felt in the daily patrols around the wall and in the sudden raids. Soldiers entered homes at random, searching for smuggled food or valuables. Collective punishment was a constant threat. If one person was caught breaking the rules, Entire families, or even streets, could be punished. Fear became part of daily rhythm, alongside hunger and exhaustion. Yet, the ghetto was not entirely silent. Underground movements began to form. Young men and women, often with little more than pistols or makeshift weapons, organized secret networks to resist German control. At this stage, their resistance was not open battle, but the gathering of information, the creation of secret newspapers, and the smuggling of weapons into the ghetto. The seeds of the later uprising were already being planted in these early years. Still, most people focused not on resistance, but on endurance. The ghetto was filled with tailors, bakers, cobblers, and doctors trying to continue their trades despite impossible conditions. Hospitals had little medicine, yet doctors worked tirelessly to treat the endless cases of typhus and malnutrition. Tailors sewed clothing from scraps, and bakers produced bread from whatever flour substitutes they could obtain. Survival strategies varied. Some bartered valuables for food, exchanging family heirlooms for a few loaves of bread. Others relied on networks of friends outside the ghetto who risked punishment to deliver supplies. Many clung to faith, praying daily for deliverance. Others began to lose faith, questioning the silence of God in the face of so much suffering. The physical environment reflected the collapse of ordinary life. Apartments were overcrowded, with multiple families squeezed into a single room. Sanitation failed, and piles of waste filled the streets. Public baths, once normal, became luxuries. Clean water was scarce. The stench of illness mixed with the smoke of makeshift stoves and the sound of coughing children. But within this bleakness, moments of profound humanity endured. Diaries kept by residents showed children drawing pictures, adults sharing jokes, and families clinging to ritual. Weddings still took place, though the celebrations were small. Babies were born, though many would not survive. There was an unspoken determination to preserve life in the face of a system designed to erase it. As the ghetto continued, deportations began. Starting in 1942, German authorities launched massive operations to send residents to extermination camps like Treblinka. Streets filled with German trucks, and families were torn apart in chaotic roundups. Fear intensified, yet many still clung to daily routines, uncertain of what lay beyond the walls, but hoping to survive one more day. The Warsaw Ghetto was not just a place of suffering, it was a mirror of the Holocaust's shadow across Europe. Bureaucracy, starvation, resistance, and resilience coexisted in its streets. Each diary, each hidden classroom, each loaf of smuggled bread represented the stubbornness of human life in the face of annihilation. And yet, one cannot help but wonder, in a world sealed by walls, where every avenue of escape was blocked, how long could ordinary people hold on to hope before the weight of the shadow finally consumed them? Asterisk, when the Warsaw Ghetto walls rose higher, it was not only stone and mortar that enclosed the Jewish population, but an entire system of control. The wall was more than a physical boundary. It was a symbol of separation, a deliberate reminder that those inside were no longer part of the city they had once called home. For the Germans, the wall represented order, segregation, and domination. For the residents inside, it was the daily outline of their confinement. Barrier visible from every street corner. The daily life within the ghetto increasingly revolved around lines for food, lines for permits, lines for labor assignments. Standing in queues became a part of survival. People rose before dawn to wait outside the ration offices, clutching small scraps of paper that determined their week's allotment. They stood in the cold or the rain, often only to be told the supplies had run out. The frustration was as heavy as the hunger itself. The official food rations provided by the German authorities were grotesquely inadequate. Where a German citizen might receive 2,600 calories a day, Jews in the ghetto were allocated less than 300. To live required supplementing this starvation diet. Smuggling, though punishable by death, became essential. Children, thin enough to squeeze through cracks in the wall or slip under gates, carried sacks of potatoes, bread, or onions hidden beneath their clothes. Their bravery was extraordinary, but so was the danger. German patrols regularly shot smugglers on sight, yet parents continued to send their children out, torn between fear and necessity. Asterisk markets inside the ghetto reflected this strange economy. Official shops offered little but black bread and turnip soup. On street corners, however, smuggled goods, eardags, milk, even a few scraps of meat, sold at exorbitant prices. Wealthier families, those who had managed to hide jewels or money, could purchase such luxuries. The poor, who had nothing left to barter, often starved in plain sight. Street children begged openly, their bodies small and frail, their voices thin. Death from hunger became a daily sight, so common that it hardly caused a stir. Asterisk. Despite such despair, cultural life did not vanish. Indeed, many residents clung to culture as a means of resistance. Secret schools taught children arithmetic and languages, though classes were often interrupted by raids. Underground libraries circulated books. Poetry readings and concerts took place in cellars or private rooms, where the sound of a violin or a recited line of verse gave a fleeting sense of dignity. Even in hunger, people wrote diaries, recording the monotony of life, the indignity of dependence, and the small joys that somehow persisted. Religion, too, endured. Rabbis continued to lead services when possible, often in hidden apartments. Jewish holidays were observed quietly, with makeshift candles or whispered prayers. These acts, though outwardly small, were profound declarations that life could still hold meaning. The Judenat, the Jewish council imposed by the Germans, was both a source of order and a target of resentment. On one hand, it coordinated food distribution, managed housing assignments, and tried to maintain some semblance of structure. On the other hand, it was forced to enforce German orders, including the preparation of deportation lists. This position placed the council in an impossible moral dilemma. To cooperate meant complicity, yet to resist meant destruction. Ordinary residents often viewed the Judenrat with suspicion, blaming them for the impossible choices imposed by the occupiers. Health conditions in the ghetto deteriorated quickly. Typhus, carried by lice, spread through overcrowded apartments. Doctors and nurses worked tirelessly in makeshift hospitals. Though medicine was scarce, they documented symptoms meticulously, not only to treat the ill, but to leave behind a record of what was happening. Physicians in the ghetto knew that survival was uncertain, yet they clung to the hope that their scientific notes might outlive them. Some of these medical reports, smuggled out, would later provide critical evidence of the deliberate starvation policies in the ghettos. Children grew up in this environment of hunger, illness, and fear. Their games often mirrored their reality. Instead of playing house, they played deportation or patrol, imitating the German soldiers they saw on the streets. Many children stopped attending secret schools altogether, forced instead to work as smugglers or beggars. Their lives shortened to immediate survival, their futures stolen before they could begin. By 1942, the shadow over the ghetto grew darker. Rumors circulated of mass killings in distant camps. Few believed the full extent of these whispers. The reality was too monstrous to imagine, but the increasing deportations suggested something was changing. German trucks rolled in more frequently, filling the streets with soldiers who barked orders and gathered residents. Families were forced to pack within minutes, given no explanation of where they were being taken. The deportations, known as Gross Action Warschau, began in July 1942. Each day, thousands of residents were marched to the Amtslagplatz, a railway station that became infamous as the departure point to Treblinka extermination camp. The process was orderly on paper, brutal in reality. Deportation lists were drawn up by the Judenrat, enforced by Jewish police under German command. Those caught in the sweeps were loaded into cattle cars, pressed together so tightly that breathing became difficult. They carried only what they could hold. Many never returned. Inside the ghetto, the remaining population was gripped by terror. Deportations were unpredictable. No one knew who would be taken next. Families tried to hide in cellars, attics, or specially constructed bunkers. Smuggling tunnels, once used for food, became escape routes. Yet, even in hiding, the danger was immense. German soldiers conducted searches with dogs, and anyone discovered was shot immediately. Amid this chaos, underground resistance networks grew stronger. Young men and women, often teenagers, began organizing more seriously. They smuggled not just food, but weapons, pistols, grenades, and even a few rifles. They trained in secret, preparing for a moment when resistance would be unavoidable. Their work was fueled by a grim realization. Deportation did not mean resettlement, as the Germans claimed, but likely death. Still, life went on, even as the population dwindled. Shops opened each morning, selling scraps of food. Tailors stitched clothing from old fabric. Teachers whispered lessons in secret classrooms. Weddings, though rare, still took place, offering families a fleeting moment of celebration. The persistence of normal life was a form of quiet defiance, a refusal to let the ghetto become nothing but despair. What is striking in these years is the coexistence of hope and hopelessness. Some residents believed survival was still possible, clinging to faith in eventual liberation. Others, worn down by hunger and grief, gave up. Suicide became more common, a tragic escape from the unbearable weight of existence. The Warsaw Ghetto was a place of paradoxes. It was a prison, yet within it, people built schools. It was a place of starvation, yet there were still concerts. It was a space of death, yet children were born. Every act of life became, in its own way, an act of resistance. And yet, as deportations continued, one question grew louder in every household, changed in every whispered conversation. If the walls were built to contain them and the trains carried them away, was there any future left for those who remained? Asterisk. By the end of 1942, the Warsaw Ghetto was a place transformed. Once home to more than 400,000 souls, its population had been decimated by deportations, disease, and starvation. Where once the streets teemed with life, they now stretched half empty, lined with abandoned buildings whose broken windows looked out like hollow eyes. The silence of absence was its own kind of oppression, a reminder that entire families had vanished without a trace. For those who remained, every day was shadowed by fear and uncertainty. The deportations to Treblinka had stripped the ghetto of its majority, leaving behind a population of perhaps 60,000, mainly those deemed useful for labor. Factories inside the ghetto continued to operate, producing goods for the German war. Effort, tailors sewed uniforms, carpenters built wooden supplies, and metalworkers forged equipment. Work meant temporary reprieve, but it also meant complicity in a system that was destroying them. Survival balanced precariously on the demands of the occupiers. The survivors who remained began adapting in more desperate ways. Cellars became living spaces. Families built hidden bunkers beneath floorboards or behind false walls. These hiding places, called Malin, were stocked with scraps of food and water, designed to withstand raids. For many, survival no longer meant living openly in the ghetto, but vanishing within it. Entire families disappeared into shadows, surfacing only at night to collect water or exchange whispered news. The Germans, aware of this pattern, intensified their searches. Patrols, came without warning, kicking in doors, dragging residents into the streets, and burning buildings suspected of hiding people. The cruelty was methodical, designed not only to capture, but to terrify. Each search destroyed not just property, but the fragile sense of safety people tried to preserve. Despite everything, resistance solidified. By early 1943, underground organizations like the Jewish Combat Organization (GOB) and the Jewish Military Union (ZW) had taken shape. These groups, composed mainly of young men and women, were fueled by the knowledge that deportation equaled death. They smuggled weapons, trained fighters, and built networks of communication. The idea of revolt spread through the ghetto not as a path to survival, but as a final declaration of dignity for the broader population. However, life continued in its monotonous rhythm of hunger and exhaustion. Bread remained the measure of existence. Families scraped together meager meals, often from soup made of weeds or bread stretched with sawdust. Illness was constant, yet hospitals had dwindled to near uselessness. Doctors worked more as record keepers than healers, documenting symptoms for the future rather than offering cures they no longer possessed. The children who survived to this point bore the marks of their world. Then, undersized, with eyes far older than their years, they had grown up amid starvation and loss. They knew the sound of boots against cobblestones, the cry of families dragged from homes, the silence after deportations. Then, in April 1943, the Germans launched their final campaign, the liquidation of the Warsaw Ghetto. Armed units entered the ghetto with orders to deport or kill the remaining population and dismantle the ghetto entirely. But resistance met them head-on. Fighters from GOB and ZW rose from the bunkers, armed with pistols, rifles, and homemade bombs against tanks and flamethrowers. Their weapons were pitifully small, yet their determination was immense. The uprising lasted nearly a month. From April 19th to May 16th, 1943, battles raged through the streets. Fighters struck from rooftops, hurled grenades into patrols, and vanished into tunnels. German forces responded with overwhelming brutality, burning entire blocks, using poison gas in bunkers, and demolishing buildings to flush out survivors. The ghetto, once a city within a city, was reduced to rubble. For those who did not fight, hiding became the only chance of survival. Families crouched in bunkers as smoke seeped through cracks, as walls shook from explosions. Days passed in suffocating silence, broken only by muffled sobs or whispered prayers. Hunger gnawed, believing hiding places meant certain death. Some families were discovered and executed on the spot. Others were buried alive as buildings collapsed. By mid-May, the uprising was crushed. German commander Jürgen Stroop famously reported, "The Jewish quarter of Warsaw is no more." His final act of triumph was the destruction of the great synagogue, a symbol of Jewish life and resilience, blown to rubble as a demonstration of conquest. Yet the story did not end there. Survivors emerged from ruins, carried into captivity, or deported to extermination camps. Few made it beyond. But the uprising itself left an indelible mark. For the first time, the Germans faced organized Jewish resistance on a large scale. Though militarily crushed, the revolt demonstrated a refusal to go silently into death. It became a testament to dignity amid despair. Remembered long after the ghetto itself was gone, the Warsaw Ghetto, in its rise and destruction, revealed the mechanics of the Holocaust in microcosm: bureaucratic segregation, starvation, deportation, resistance, and annihilation. It showed how an entire community was enclosed, controlled, and systematically destroyed. Yet, it also showed the persistence of life schools, libraries, weddings, against impossible odds. Today, the ruins are gone. The walls that once imprisoned hundreds of thousands no longer stand. Modern Warsaw rises over the ground, where children smuggled bread, where families prayed in secret, where young fighters resisted tanks with pistols. Yet, the shadow lingers beneath the pavement. Beneath the hum of the present-day city lies the memory of lives lived in confinement and ended in fire. And perhaps the most haunting question remains: when survival seemed impossible, when every avenue closed, what did it mean to resist him not for life, but for the dignity of leaving behind a trace that could not be erased? Asterisk, when you think of war, perhaps your mind first drifts to battlefields, to the thunder of artillery, or to the silence of ruined cities. Yet for millions of civilians during the Holocaust's shadow, war was not primarily about gunfire. It was about food, or, more precisely, the absence of it. Daily existence revolved around calories, bread loaves, and a long wait in ration queues. The German occupation of much of Europe brought not only violence, but also an entire system of food control. Through rationing, the occupiers held power over both conquered populations and those they marked for destruction. To understand what life was like under this shadow, one must begin with the small, ordinary details of daily meals, or the lack thereof, in Poland. For example, official ration cards became the currency of life. Without them, one could not buy bread, potatoes, or even the thin turnip soup distributed in communal kitchens. But the cards were not equal. German citizens in occupied Poland were allocated around 2,600 calories per day. Poles received about 600 to 800. Jews were allotted less than 200. These numbers alone tell the story. Deliberate starvation built into the structure of daily life. A typical Jewish ration consisted of a small loaf of bread, often mixed with sawdust or other fillers, and perhaps a few ounces of margarine or sugar. Meat was nearly non-existent. Potatoes, when available, were considered a luxury. Families broke loaves into tiny pieces, stretching them across meals. Hunger gnawed constantly, leaving stomachs aching, heads light, pills too weak to work. Queues for food stretched for hours. People lined up in freezing cold or driving rain, clutching ration cards like lifelines. Mothers brought children, hoping their presence might evoke sympathy from clerks. Yet, when the food ran out, there was nothing to be done. People shuffled away empty-handed, their children crying with hunger for those with means. The black market offered alternatives. Farmers and smugglers risked punishment to bring food into the cities, selling eggs, milk, or onions at staggering prices. A pound of butter might cost the equivalent of several months' wages. Wealthier families sold jewelry or heirlooms to buy food, while the poor starved. Hunger became not just a physical experience, but a brutal sorting mechanism. Those with resources had a chance. Those without did not. Smuggling became a lifeline. In ghettos like Warsaw or D, children slipped through cracks in the walls or sewer tunnels to bring back sacks of flour or potatoes. These children, often no older than 10, risked death every day. German guards patrolled the walls, ready to shoot smugglers on sight. Yet families depended on their courage. Diaries from the ghettos speak of children returning with mud-stained clothes and triumphant smiles, carrying a few precious pounds of food that meant survival for another week. Inside ghettos, communal kitchens, called soup kitchens, distributed thin broth. A bowl of watery soup with a few potato peels or turnip slices became the centerpiece of daily meals. People carried jars or battered pots, waiting in line for ladles of steaming liquid. The smell, though faint, filled the streets and drew long crowds, but the soup rarely satisfied. Instead, it offered only the promise of not collapsing before nightfall. Starvation changed the body. People lost weight rapidly, their cheeks hollowing, their eyes sinking, muscles wasted away. Children stopped growing, their bones brittle. Diseases like tuberculosis and typhus spread more easily in weakened bodies. Hunger did not just kill directly, made people more vulnerable to every other form of illness. Psychologically, hunger shaped thoughts. Diaries and memoirs show how food dominated conversations. Families sat around tables discussing recipes, from memory describing feasts they once had, or imagining meals that would never come again. These conversations were not indulgent fantasies, but coping mechanisms, ways to remind themselves of a world where food had been plentiful, yet hunger also eroded social bonds. Neighbors competed for scraps, families argued over rations, and theft became common. A loaf of bread could dissolve friendships, destroy trust, or provoke violence. At the same time, acts of kindness emerged. Some shared their meager portions with the weakest, or mothers gave their own food to their children. Hunger revealed both the cruelty and the compassion within human beings. In concentration camps, food rations were even more brutal. Prisoners at Auschwitz, for example, were typically given a piece of bread, a cup of black coffee substitute in the morning, and watery soup at midday. In the evening, another slice of bread, sometimes with a smear of margarine or sausage, completed the day's diet together. This amounted to less than 1,500 calories, far below what was needed for men and women performing grueling, forced labor. The result was predictable: exhaustion, collapse, and death. Prisoners developed rituals around food. They divided bread carefully, cutting it into equal slices to avoid disputes. Some hid part of their ration, saving it for later, though many could not resist eating it immediately. The bread, dry and coarse, became the symbol of survival. Prisoners dreamed of bread, spoke of bread, fought over bread. In their world, a crust of bread was as precious as gold. In labor camps, prisoners also scavenged. Potato peels thrown away by guards, crumbs swept from the floor, even weeds growing near fences became sources of sustenance. Some prisoners risked punishment to steal animal feed. Others bartered clothing or labor for food scraps. The line between survival and starvation was so thin that a single stolen potato could make the difference between life and death. The German authorities were fully aware of this dynamic. Starvation was not an accident of war. It was policy. By reducing rations for Jews and other targeted groups, they weaponized hunger as a tool of control and destruction. People weakened by hunger were easier to manage, less capable of resistance. Starvation, combined with disease, became one of the most effective means of mass murder. At the same time, food rations shaped entire societies. In occupied France, rationing cards dictated meals for millions of civilians. Butter, meat, and sugar became luxuries. Families learned to substitute with ersatz products: chicory instead of coffee, chestnut flour instead of wheat, turnip jam instead of fruit preserves. Housewives experimented with new recipes, trying to make meals from whatever was available. These substitutions entered daily memory, symbols of wartime hardship that lingered long after the war. The monotony of rations was itself oppressive. Eating the same thin bread, the same watery soup, day after day drained not only the body, but the spirit. Food lost its joy, its social role, its ability to bring comfort. Meals became transactions, ways to silence hunger for a few hours. And yet, within this bleak landscape, acts of resilience shone through. Some families managed to keep traditions alive, even with little. On holidays, they prepared symbolic meals, perhaps a small piece of potato fried in oil, or a crust of bread, blessed before eating. These gestures transformed starvation into a shared ritual of remembrance, a refusal to let hunger erase identity. Food became memory. A grandmother recited the taste of cakes once baked at weddings. A father described the smell of roasted chicken from pre-war Sabbath dinners. These memories were sustenance of another kind, keeping alive the knowledge of a world that had been stolen. But beneath all this lay a question that haunted every table, every soup kitchen, every ration line. How long could people endure on bread, potatoes, and nothing else? Asterisk hunger, once it settles into the body, does not leave quickly. It creeps into the bones, slows movement, clouds the mind, and dulls the senses. In the ghettos, the camps, and the occupied cities of Europe, rationing was not only about physical scarcity, but about the long erosion of human strength and spirit. The Germans understood this indeed. They designed it. Starvation was policy, methodical and deliberate, applied with the precision of bureaucracy. The daily bread was the most visible reminder. In many ghettos, each person was allocated a small loaf per week. Bakers mixed the flour with fillers, sawdust, ground straw, even chalk. The loaves were dense and heavy, their crusts gray rather than golden. Cutting them required strength, and chewing them was slow work. Yet even these loaves rarely reached the poorest. Many disappeared through theft or bribery long before reaching distribution lines. Potatoes became symbols of survival. Families stored them in cellars, guarding them as treasure. A single potato could be sliced into thin strips, fried in a pan. With a drop of olive oil could be found door-boiled and mashed to feed a family of 5. Diaries from the D-Ghetto record, mothers counting potatoes, one by one, deciding whether to eat them immediately or save them for later. These decisions were moral as much as practical. Feed a child today, or all the children tomorrow. Soup kitchens offered thin broth that often contained little more than water with floating turnip peels. Still, the lines for it stretched endlessly. People carried cracked bowls and battered cans, waiting for a ladleful that would not fill their stomachs, but might stave off collapse. The smell of soup, faint, watery, but still a smell of food, lingered in the streets long after the kitchens. Closed smuggling networks expanded because official rations were never enough. Children, small and agile, crawled under fences, slipped through sewer grates, or climbed crumbling walls. They carried sacks of onions, flour, or carrots on their backs, sometimes bigger than themselves. Guards patrolled constantly, their rifles ready. Many children never returned. Yet others succeeded, and their families survived because of their courage. Hunger turned children into breadwinners, literally, in every sense. In concentration and labor camps, the rhythm of food distribution structured the day. Prisoners awoke at dawn, their first taste of the day, a cup of watery coffee substitute. At midday, they received soup, often with a faint vegetable or grain, more often just water thickened with a little flour. At night, bread again, sometimes with margarine or a smear of sausage. The calories totaled far below what was needed for 12 hours of forced labor. Prisoners developed systems for dividing rations. Bread was cut with mathematical precision, often using strings or sharp scraps of metal. To cheat another prisoner out of a slice was to risk violence. A loaf of bread could spark fights, betrayals, or even murder. Yet, in other cases, prisoners shared. A dying man might give his ration to a friend, knowing he would not live to eat it anyway. These small acts of generosity stand out as fragile threads of humanity in the bleakness of starvation. Psychologically, hunger distorted everything. People dreamed of food at night, waking to disappointment. They spoke endlessly of recipes, recalling meals they had once enjoyed. Roast chicken with herbs, cakes baked at weddings, apples eaten fresh in autumn. These conversations were bittersweet, comforting, but also painful reminders of what was lost. In ghettos, underground newspapers even printed recipes, though no one had the ingredients to make them. Reading them was an act of remembrance, a way of holding on to a culture through memory of taste. For children, Hunger stunted growth. Bones failed to develop. Teeth rotted. Hair thinned. Teachers in secret schools wrote of students fainting during lessons, their heads too heavy to hold upright. Many children carried distended stomachs, swollen not with food, but with malnutrition. Their eyes looked older than their years, dulled by exhaustion. Yet, they still played in scraps of time, their games often revolving around food, pretending to bake bread, to eat imaginary feasts, to cook soup from stones. The Germans used hunger as leverage. Work assignments were often linked to food rations. Laborers in certain factories received slightly larger portions. These extra rations became incentives, encouraging people to compete for the hardest, most dangerous jobs. In camps, guards sometimes distributed extra food to those who performed brutal tasks, like beating fellow prisoners or assisting with selections. Starvation thus corroded not only bodies, but also moral boundaries, twisting survival into complicity. In occupied cities like Paris, Amsterdam, or Brussels, rationing also shaped daily life. Families collected ration cards and exchanged them for fixed quantities at state-run shops. Queues formed each morning, winding through streets, guarded by police. Housewives learned to make meals from substitutes, roasted chicory roots instead of coffee, margarine instead of butter, turnip jam instead of fruit, preserves. These ersatz foods became symbols of the occupation, remembered for their blandness and the frustration they caused. But unlike Jews in ghettos, many non-Jewish civilians had access to underground supply chains. Farmers sold produce secretly too. City markets, stints groups forged ration cards, enabling some to escape hunger. Still, malnutrition spread widely. Letters from occupied France described thin children, frail workers, and families struggling to keep homes warm while cooking only watery stews. One cannot ignore the role of women in this system. Mothers bore the impossible task of stretching meager rations. They invented new recipes, calculated portions with ruthless care, and sometimes starved themselves to feed their children. Many diaries speak of women fainting from hunger, yet pressing their children to eat first. Their sacrifices left deep imprints on family memory, recalled long after the war. Starvation's cruelty was its relentlessness. Unlike sudden violence, it worked slowly, day after day, wearing people down. There was no single moment of death. For most victims of hunger only, the gradual fading of strength until one could no longer rise from bed. Cemeteries near ghettos filled with bodies of those who had simply wasted away. Their lives measured in ounces of bread and ladles of soup. And yet, amid this monotony of deprivation, questions lingered. How long could the human body survive on less than a crust a day? How many families were torn apart, not by gunfire, but by the silence of empty bowls? Asterisk, by 1943, hunger was no longer simply a background condition of life under the Holocaust's shadow. It was the central fact of existence. In ghettos, camps, and occupied towns, people measured time not by calendars, but by meals if they came at all. Rations had become the framework through which every decision was made, every hope weighed, and every act of survival negotiated. The ghettos illustrate this most starkly. In Warsaw, diaries from the time describe how families organized their days around ration distribution. Mornings meant standing in line, clutching ration cards that had to be stamped, signed, and checked against ledgers. The weight of bureaucracy bore down on every slice of bread. When shortages occurred, arguments broke out in queues, and police were summoned to maintain order. Hunger frayed tempers, eroded patience, and reduced conversations to complaints about the taste, size, or dryness of the loaves. Children bore the brunt of starvation's cruelty. Indeed, mortality rates among children soared. Small bodies could not withstand the endless cycle of hunger and disease. Teachers who continued classes in secret apartments noted the dullness in their students' eyes, their inability to concentrate, their tendency to fall asleep mid-lesson. Homework assignments went unfinished, not from laziness, but because children lacked the energy to hold pencils. And yet, children also became the bravest smugglers. Prisoners developed elaborate rituals around food. Bread was cut precisely, often into 7 equal slices, so it could last through the week. Men argued bitterly over the thickness of slices. Some licked crumbs from their hands, unwilling to waste a single particle. Others hid their bread beneath clothing, protecting it as though it were treasure. To steal bread was the gravest offense, one that could shatter friendships or even cost lives. And yet, many also shared. A dying prisoner might hand his ration to another, a final act of human solidarity in a place designed to strip humanity away. The German authorities manipulated this desperation. Extra food was given as rewards for harsh labor, compliance, or betrayal. In ghettos, those with jobs in German-run factories received larger rations than the unemployed. In camps, those who performed brutal tasks guarding others, sorting belongings of the dead, assisting in selections, were sometimes given an extra slice of bread. Hunger thus became a tool of control, eroding moral boundaries and forcing impossible choices. Outside the ghettos and camps, rationing shaped daily life across occupied Europe. In France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, families learned to make do with substitutes: chicory coffee, powdered milk, beet sugar. Wartime cookbooks circulated with recipes for ersatz meals: turnip pie, potato pancakes without flour, carrot marmalade. Housewives stretched their ingenuity, turning scraps into meals. These substitutions entered cultural memory. Decades later, survivors of the occupation could still recall the taste of ersatz coffee with bitterness, but Jews and other targeted groups had no such substitutions. For them, hunger was not inconvenience, but annihilation. German policy deliberately starved them, stripping calories until survival became statistically impossible. Typhus, dysentery, and tuberculosis thrived in such weakened populations. Cemeteries swelled with the unburied dead. Hunger did what bullets and bombs did not need to do. The emotional weight of hunger was immense. People dreamed constantly of. Food diaries described dreams of roast chicken, of sweet cakes, of orchards heavy with fruit. Akin was painful, as the visions dissolved into the monotony of watery soup. Some prisoners, delirious with hunger, ate inedible things: grass, paper, even earth. Others hoarded crumbs, chewing slowly to prolong the sensation of eating. And yet, amid this deprivation, families still tried to preserve rituals. In ghettos, holidays were marked with symbolic meals. On Passover, some baked mats-like bread from potato flour. On Sabbath evenings, candles were lit, and a crust of bread was blessed. These gestures did not feed the body, but they fed the spirit. They declared that identity, faith, and memory could not be entirely erased by hunger. Food also became a measure of social divisions. Wealthier families who managed to hide valuables could barter for butter, cheese, or meat. The poor, with nothing to trade, wasted away. Hunger deepened inequality, turning ghettos into societies stratified by access to calories. Even in camps, where rations were uniformly low, privileges existed. Capos prisoners, assigned supervisory roles, often received extra portions, creating resentment and reinforcing hierarchies. What is striking in testimony is how hunger shaped memory. Survivors often recall not the violence first, but the food during its absence. They describe the taste of camp bread, the texture of watery soup, the endless conversations about meals that never arrived. Hunger was not incidental. It was the defining feature of daily life. After liberation, food remained a central obsession. Survivors of camps and ghettos often ate compulsively, hoarding bread, hiding food beneath pillows, or eating until sick. Some never overcame the fear of scarcity, storing pantries full of food decades later. Hunger had scarred them so deeply that abundance became unbearable. The story of rations is, in many ways, the story of the Holocaust itself. It was not only about gas chambers or firing squads, but about the slow, deliberate erasure of life through starvation. It was about bureaucrats tallying calories, guards watching queues, children smuggling potatoes, and mothers giving up their meals so their children might live another day. And yet, the question lingers. It's quietly unsettling. When food itself became a weapon and survival meant living on bread, potatoes, and nothing else, what was left of human dignity when even eating was no longer about living, but only about not dying? Asterisk, when history recalls the Holocaust, the images that come to mind are often of barbed wire, cattle cars, and mass graves. Yet, behind these horrors lay something far quieter, far more mundane: paperwork. It was forms, ledgers, stamps, and signatures that turned prejudice into policy, and policy into annihilation. Ordinary clerks, secretaries, hand officers, men and women who never set foot in a camp, played their role by managing files, distributing ration cards, and stamping deportation orders. The bureaucracy of the Holocaust began with identification. In occupied Poland, Jews were required to register with local authorities, listing names, ages, occupations, and addresses. Each person became an entry in a ledger, a file in a cabinet, a line in a census. The act of registration may have seemed administrative, but it created the foundation for control. With these lists, the authorities knew who lived where, who worked, who was unemployed, and who could be summoned for deportation. Identification cards soon followed. In Germany, Jews were forced to carry identity papers stamped with a red J. Men named Israel, women named Sarah, not by choice, but by decree. K. These names were added to documents, printed on official papers, K, and used in every transaction: renting an apartment, buying food, traveling on trains. Bureaucracy transformed identity into a stigma, branding people through ink rather than iron. Passports, too, were altered. For the war, German Jews attempting to immigrate found their passports stamped with bold letters, restricting their movement. These stamps determined who could leave and who could not. For many, it was paperwork, not physical bars, that first trapped them in ghettos. Paperwork governed daily life. To receive food rations, one needed ration cards. To hold a job, one needed work permits signed and stamped by German officers. To move from one street to another, one often needed special permission slips. Without the correct documents, survival was nearly impossible. Hunger, labor, even shelter, all were mediated through paper. The Judenrat, the Jewish councils imposed by German authorities, were deeply entangled in this machinery. They were ordered to produce lists of workers, to distribute ration cards, to keep track of births and deaths. The councils employed clerks and bookkeepers who filled ledgers with names and numbers. Each name represented a human being, but on the page it was only ink, reduced to statistics. Diaries from ghetto residents often mention the frustration of standing in endless queues for papers, only to be told some stamp was missing, some form incomplete. And yet, these same councils were sometimes forced to prepare deportation lists. The Germans demanded quotas, a certain number of Jews to be delivered for resettlement. The Judenrat had to decide whom to place on the lists. In reality, they had little choice. Refusal meant collective punishment. But this process revealed the chilling power of paper. To be on the list was to vanish. To be off, it was to live, at least for another day. German offices produced staggering quantities of paperwork, Deportation orders required forms. Train schedules were drafted, specifying how many cattle cars would be used, what time they would depart, how many guards would accompany them. Bureaucrats calculated costs down to the last detail: how much coal the train would need, how much it would cost to transport each prisoner per kilometer. Annihilation was not only engineered with weapons, but with arithmetic. The infamous Wannsee Conference of January 1942 illustrates this cold, bureaucratic efficiency. Senior Nazi officials kept the files themselves, in some cases outlived their creators. After the war, Allied forces discovered vast archives of Nazi records, ledgers listing train schedules, files detailing confiscated property, lists of names deported from towns and villages. These papers, preserved by the very bureaucrats who created them, became critical evidence in trials. What had once been instruments of oppression became proof of atrocity, and yet one wonders how many lives were sealed by the stroke of a pen, by the click of a rubber stamp, by the neat handwriting of a clerk who never met the people whose names they recorded. Asterisk, the power of the bureaucracy was not in its violence, but in its ordinariness. To the outside observer, many of his tasks looked no different from the routine business of any government. Papers filed, stamps pressed, ledgers balanced, signatures verified. These were the motions of civil order. Yet within them, death was being organized with the precision of an accountant. One striking example is the way transport to extermination camps was scheduled. Deportations were not ad hoc, chaotic events. They were meticulously planned through correspondence between the Reich Security Main Office, the Deutsche Reichsbahn, German railways, and regional administrators. Memos were exchanged, confirming the number of trains required, the cost of coal, the availability of cattle cars, and the times of departure. Prisoners were not passengers, but entries in freight calculations. Railways even billed the SS for the transport of Jews at reduced group fares, calculated by the head. It was mass murder disguised as logistics. At the local level, bureaucrats compiled lists. In ghettos, every individual was registered, documented, categorized. German officials demanded regular reports. How many men? How many women? How many children? How many deaths? Death itself became a statistic, entered in a column, tallied alongside food distribution and housing records. The clerks who filled these reports might never have seen the bodies. Their ink, however, recorded the erasure of lives. The Jewish councils, forced intermediaries, also produced documents under German orders. They distributed ration cards, work permits, and housing assignments. They created files for each resident, carefully noting employment status or medical conditions. To outsiders, this might look like governance. In truth, it was administration, under duress, with every piece of paper eventually feeding into the machinery of deportation. The councils, caught between survival and collaboration, wrote lists that could save some and condemn others. For ordinary people, papers became a matter of life or death. A valid work permit could postpone deportation. A missing ration card could mean starvation. Families went to extraordinary lengths to secure or forge documents. Underground presses produced counterfeit papers, baptismal certificates, Aryan identity cards, travel passes. These forgeries were acts of defiance, carried out by skilled printers who risked their lives. A single forged page might allow someone to slip past a checkpoint to board a train under another name, to live beyond the walls of the ghetto. Yet the system was designed to make such escapes rare. German administrators developed intricate verification processes, special inks, embossed seals, precise formatting. Inspectors were trained to spot discrepancies. Survivors recalled the terror of presenting forged documents at checkpoints, the fear that a guard might notice a crooked stamp or an inconsistent signature. The smallest flaw could cost a life. The efficiency of the bureaucracy is evident in the archives it left behind. In D, for example, a vast set of records survives: employment rosters, ration distribution tables, death registers. These documents revealed the clinical detail with which lives were reduced to numbers. Entire families appear as entries: name, age, occupation, before vanishing abruptly from the record, their deportation noted in a margin. The silence of the pages mirrors the silence of their absence. Paper also mediated property theft. As Jews were deported, German authorities cataloged their possessions. Furniture, clothing, and household items were listed in inventories, often down to individual spoons. Confiscated property was redistributed to German families or sold at auctions. Each transaction required receipts, stamps, and ledgers. The dispossession was complete not only because soldiers carried belongings away, but because clerks documented it, legitimized it, and filed it neatly in drawers. This was perhaps the most chilling aspect. The system masked atrocity beneath routine. Soldiers carried out violence, but clerks normalized it. The signature of an official on a deportation order gave the appearance of legality. The tally in a ledger turned the deportation of a village into an administrative record. Mass killing, in this sense, did not look like chaos. It looked like office work. Bureaucrats themselves often claimed later that they were just doing their jobs. At Nuremberg, officials like Adolf Eichmann described themselves as functionaries responsible only for paperwork. Eichmann insisted he never personally killed anyone, that his role was simply to arrange trains, to coordinate timetables. His words exposed the terrible truth that genocide could be carried out not only with guns, but with pens for the victims. This distance made the system even more terrifying. They rarely saw the men who made decisions about their fate. They encountered soldiers, guards, hand police, but the real decisions were made in offices far away by individuals who might never set foot in a ghetto or camp. Their names appeared on lists prepared by people they would never meet. The anonymity of the bureaucracy compounded the sense of helplessness. And yet, paperwork could also be subverted. Brave individuals within offices sometimes manipulated records to save lives. A clerk might misfile a deportation order, lose a document, or alter a birth date to make someone appear younger and more fit for labor. Such small acts of resistance were rare, but they mattered. Survivors recalled being spared because someone's pen slipped in their favor. In these rare instances, bureaucracy, usually the tool of oppression, became the means of salvation. The moral weight of paperwork lies in its detachment. A soldier who shot a prisoner could not deny what he had done, but a clerk who filled out a form could imagine himself innocent, his task neutral. This illusion allowed thousands of people to participate in genocide without confronting its reality. They filed documents, calculated costs, stamped approvals, and then went home to their families, believing they had only done office work. The Holocaust revealed the terrifying potential of modern administration. It showed how a state with efficient bureaucracy could turn prejudice into annihilation with frightening speed. Registers, files, and schedules became instruments of death. Ordinary people became executioners, not by pulling triggers, but by pressing stamps. But one question lingers. Unsettled, if genocide can be carried out with paper and ink as effectively as with guns and bombs, what does that say about the quiet power of bureaucracy in our own time? By the spring of 1943, the machinery of paperwork had already done its work. Deportation trains left daily from cities across occupied Europe, their timetables coordinated by men at desks. Entire ghettos were emptied, their residents delivered to extermination camps. From a bureaucratic perspective, it was efficient. From a human perspective, it was annihilation. And yet, those who pushed the papers often saw themselves not as murderers, but as administrators. The paradox of bureaucracy is that it thrives on distance. The The man who scheduled a deportation train never heard the screams of families separated on the platform. Okay. The clerk who stamped ration cards never smelled the stench of starvation in the ghettos. Okay. The woman who typed lists of names never saw the cattle cars into which those names were packed. It was this very distance that made the system sustainable for so long. Atrocity hidden beneath office routine. The scale of record keeping was immense. CAPE authorities maintained meticulous ledgers of prisoners, arrival dates, identification numbers, work assignments, deaths. When new transports arrived, names were recorded, numbers tattooed, files updated. Deaths were often logged with euphemisms like heart failure or pneumonia language that concealed the reality of gas chambers. This created the appearance of order, of bureaucratic neatness, even as tens of thousands were murdered each week. Beyond the camps, ministries in Berlin processed endless correspondence. Memos passed between the Reich's security main office, the Ministry of Transport, and local governments. These memos debated not morality, but logistics. How to allocate scarce railway cars. How to balance deportation schedules with military supply needs. How to assign guards to transports. Such questions treated human beings as cargo. In ghettos like Warsaw and D, paperwork was omnipresent. Residents lined up for permits, submitted forms for housing, and carried identification papers at all times. For many, survival depended not on physical strength, but on paperwork, having the right stamp, the right signature, the right card. Those who lacked them were excluded from rations, arrested in raids, or deported. Diaries recall the panic of losing a single document, the desperate attempts to forge new ones, the hours spent in queues, hoping to secure a stamp that might buy another week of life. The Judearet offices became centers of this paper economy. Clerks typed constantly, producing ration cards, work assignments, and registration lists. Their ledgers recorded births, deaths, and deportations. Each entry was a human life, reduced to a line of ink. For those who worked in these offices, the moral weight was crushing. It's believed that by cooperating, they could prolong survival for a few. Others felt complicit in destruction, yet all were trapped in the system, forced to write lists that would one day be used against their own people. For the Germans, paperwork was not only a tool of control, but also of justification. It gave their actions the appearance of legality. Deportations were not framed as arbitrary violence, but as resettlements confirmed by official forms. Confiscation of property was documented through receipts and inventories. Killings were masked as special treatments in reports. The language of bureaucracy sanitized atrocity, making it palatable to those who carried it out. This language, deliberately bland, played a crucial role. Euphemisms shielded both perpetrators and bystanders from the full reality of what was happening. To say that prisoners had been given Sonderbehandlung special treatment was easier than admitting they had been gassed. To mark deaths as natural causes was easier than recording mass murder. The system of paperwork, thus, not only organized, genocide, but also concealed it at the war's end. However, the very records that facilitated the Holocaust became evidence against its architects. When Allied forces captured German offices, they found filing cabinets stuffed with deportation lists, transport schedules, and property inventories. The meticulousness of the bureaucracy betrayed its own crimes. At Nuremberg, prosecutors presented memos, orders, and train schedules to prove the systematic nature of the Holocaust. The documents, once tools of oppression, became instruments of justice. One infamous example was the Stroop Report, compiled after the suppression of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in 1943, written by SS Commander Jürgen Stroop. The report contained daily entries detailing the destruction of the ghetto and the killing or deportation of its residents. It included photographs, captions, and final tallies. Stroop intended it as a record of his success. Instead, it became damning evidence at his trial. His paperwork, created to glorify atrocity, ultimately condemned its author. For survivors, the memory of paperwork often carried as much weight as memories of violence. They recalled the endless queues, the stamps and signatures, the constant fear of losing a document. Some remembered the relief of receiving a work permit that spared them deportation, only to see it later revoked. Others remembered the betrayal of being placed on a deportation list without explanation. Paperwork haunted them as much as barbed wire did. The bureaucracy of the Holocaust reminds us that genocide does not always roar with violence. Sometimes it whispers through clerks, stamps, and memos. It reveals how systems designed to organize societies can be turned to war destruction, how neutrality can become complicity, how ink can be as lethal as bullets. Today, historians and archivists sift through these records. The files are fragile, the ink fading, yet their weight is immense. Each document carries within it the trace of a life, the shadow of a decision, the silence of absence. They are both evidence and memorial, testimony to a system that tried to reduce millions to paperwork. And the unresolved question remains: ordinary bureaucracy could once become the instrument of mass murder. How safe are we from its quiet power in our own time when the next file, the next ledger, the next stamped paper might again decide who belongs and who does not? Asterisk. When the word camp is spoken in connection with the Holocaust, certain names immediately rise to memory: Auschwitz, Dachau, Treblinka, Bergen-Belsen. These are the names engraved in history, places where millions perished and where liberation revealed the scale of horror. Yet scattered across occupied Europe were hundreds of smaller camps, labor camps, transit camps, satellite camps that remain largely forgotten. Their names rarely appear in textbooks, their sites often unmarked, their victims remembered only in fragments. These forgotten camps were not always designed for immediate extermination. Instead, they were built for labor grinding, endless, back-breaking labor. Brick factories, quarries, farms, and munitions plants needed workers. And the Germans supplied them not with free labor, but with enslaved human beings. Men, women, and even children were shipped to these sites, registered, and assigned to work until they collapsed. The system was not accidental, it was deliberate exploitation, squeezing every ounce of energy from prisoners before discarding them. Unlike the vast complexes of Auschwitz or Majdanek, many of these labor camps were small, with only a few hundred or a few thousand inmates at a time. Their scale made them invisible in the larger story, but their conditions were no less brutal. Guards patrolled the perimeters, fences enclosed the compounds, and barracks housed the prisoners in overcrowded filth. Food rations were meager: black bread, watery soup, coffee, substitute, hours of work stretched from dawn until night, with little pause. One such camp was Plaszow, near Krakow, in Poland. Originally established as a forced labor camp, it later became infamous as the place overseen by Commandant Amon Gita T, whose cruelty was legendary. Prisoners worked in quarries and factories, often under the whip of guards. Tithi himself was known to stand on his balcony and shoot prisoners at random, turning the camp into both a workplace and a site of terror. Other camps were smaller still, scattered across Germany and occupied territories. In places like Middle Badora, prisoners built V-2 rockets in underground tunnels, working in darkness and choking dust. The rockets that rained down on London and Antwerp were constructed by starving men whose lives were extinguished by exhaustion and disease. Long before the weapons ever left the ground, the tunnels claimed more lives than the rockets themselves and occupied Eastern Europe. Camps sprang up near farms and factories. Prisoners cut timber, harvested crops, or mined coal. The work was menial, but the conditions made it deadly. Without proper clothing, prisoners froze in winter. Without boots, their feet bled. Without food, they collapsed at their posts. Guards responded, not with pity, but with beatings, ensuring that fear replaced any thought of resistance. The monotony of labor was its own cruelty. Survivors recall swinging pickaxes hour after hour, carrying stones endlessly, digging trenches that seemed to serve no purpose. Work became both meaningless and fatal. Prisoners were driven to exhaustion, their bodies wasting until they could no longer lift a shovel. When they collapsed, they were often beaten, then replaced by new arrivals. Life expectancy in many of these camps was measured not in years, but in weeks, unlike extermination camps, which were designed for mass killing. These labor camps killed through neglect and overwork. Death came not in gas chambers, but through starvation, disease, accidents, and beatings. Typhus swept through barracks, spread by lice and filth. Pneumonia claimed prisoners left exposed to rain and cold. Malnutrition weakened immune systems until even minor infections became fatal. Yet records of these camps are often incomplete. Many were dismantled before the end of the war. Guards destroyed files, tore down barracks, and left little trace. In some cases, the land was reused, farms replanted, factories reopened, erasing physical evidence. Survivors, few in number, carried the memory. But their stories were often overshadowed by the larger narratives of Auschwitz or Dachau. The existence of these forgotten camps reveals how widespread the system truly was. The Holocaust was not confined to a few notorious sites. It spread like a web across Europe, reaching into towns and villages. A factory in one town, a quarry in another, a farm in the countryside, all became places of forced labor. Ordinary Germans and local collaborators saw prisoners marched daily to work, their striped uniforms visible, their frailty unmistakable. The camps were not invisible. They were woven into the daily life of occupied Europe. For the prisoners' survival, strategies were limited. Some tried to conserve energy by working slowly, risking beatings. Others sought small advantages, standing near sympathetic guards, trading scraps of food, or hiding in shadows during roll call. Occasionally, prisoners sabotaged their work deliberately. The forgotten camps also remind us of the role of industry. German companies contracted with the SS for labor. Firms in armaments, chemicals, textiles, and agriculture all profited from forced labor. Men filed paperwork, signed contracts, and received shipments of workers as though they were supplies. The camps were not isolated monstrosities. They were embedded in the economic fabric of the war effort. And yet, when the war ended, these camps slipped from memory. Trials focused on the major camps, on the names that symbolized the Holocaust's enormity. Smaller camps, with fewer survivors and less documentation, faded into the margins. Their victims, though numbered in the hundreds of thousands, were left without monuments. Their suffering remembered only in fragments of testimony. one question lingers when we think of these sites. If history remembers only the most infamous names, what becomes of the voices from the camps, too small, too ordinary, too boring to mark in textbooks? Asterisk, the system of labor camps was vast, yet it functioned in silence. Unlike Auschwitz, where the chimneys of crematoria blacken the sky, many labor camps left no such dramatic scars. They were smaller, scattered, easily hidden behind ordinary landscapes. A sawmill, a quarry, a textile factory each could become the center of a camp. Prisoners marched to work in the morning, escorted by guards, and returned at night to wooden barracks. To bystanders, it could almost resemble a work camp in the ordinary sense. But inside, the reality was far from ordinary. Conditions were deliberately calculated to wear prisoners down. Barracks were overcrowded, often housing twice or three times their intended number. Wooden bunks stacked 3 high-heeled men and women with no mattresses, only straw that quickly became infested with lice. In winter, the barracks froze. Survivors recall waking to find frost covering the inside walls, their breath hanging like smoke. In summer, the stench of sweat, filth, and disease filled the air, unbearable in the heat. Roll calls began before dawn. All prisoners lined up in the cold, often standing for hours as guards counted and recounted. Those who collapsed were beaten or shot. After roll call, work began. In stone quarries, prisoners lifted and carried blocks heavier than their weakened bodies could bear. In forests, they felled trees with blunt axes. In factories, they worked long hours assembling munitions or textiles, their fingers raw and bleeding. The rhythm was relentless. Work, beatings, hunger, sleep. Food rations were meager. A small piece of black bread in the morning, watery soup at midday, perhaps a potato at night. The calories never matched the labor required. Starvation and exhaustion compounded until bodies wasted away. Those too weak to work were deemed useless and often shot or sent on transports to extermination camps. The logic was simple: labor until death, and if labor failed, eliminate. Mittelbau-Dora. One of the most infamous labor camps shows the extremity of these conditions. Established for the production of V-2 rockets, the camp forced prisoners to work in underground tunnels. The air was thick with dust, the darkness disorienting, the noise of machinery deafening. Prisoners labored in 12-hour shifts without seeing daylight. They inhaled rock dust, which coated their lungs, leading to respiratory collapse. Many died within weeks. Yet, the rockets they built rained destruction on Allied cities, tying their suffering directly to the machinery of war. Other camps were attached to industrial companies. Kifarben, Siemens, Krapal profited from forced labor. Prisoners worked in chemical plants, steel mills, and armaments factories, producing goods for the German war effort. Contracts between the SS and these firms treated human beings as resources, listed alongside coal, steel, and oil. Payment was made per worker, per day, with no concern for how long the worker survived. The camps became nodes in an industrial chain, their brutality hidden behind the ledges of business. The geographical spread of these camps was astonishing. From Norway to Greece, from France to Poland, labor camps dotted the map. Some housed political prisoners, others Jews, Roma, or Soviet Poles. Their purposes varied: building roads, digging trenches, harvesting crops, but the pattern was the same: extract labor until death. For local populations, the camps were not invisible. Villagers saw columns of prisoners marching past each morning, their striped uniforms unmistakable. Farmers sold produce to camp kitchens. Shopkeepers interacted with guards. Railway workers handled transports. Many looked away, unwilling or afraid to intervene. A few smuggled food to prisoners, risking punishment. Most carried on with daily life, even as the camps operated in plain sight. Survivors often emphasize the monotony of these camps, unlike extermination camps, where terror was immediate. Labor camps killed slowly. Prisoners woke each day to the same routine: roll call, labor, hunger. There were few dramatic moments, only the dull erosion of life. This monotony is part of why the camps were forgotten. They lacked the spectacle of mass killing, yet they consumed hundreds of thousands of lives through attrition. Illness spread rapidly. Typhus, dysentery, pneumonia all thrived in overcrowded, unsanitary barracks. With little medicine available, even minor wounds could fester and kill. Prisoners who fell ill were often sent to infirmaries with no supplies, where they lay until death. Others were removed from the rolls altogether, transferred to extermination sites. The paperwork disguised the reality. Death by disease or starvation was as final as death in a gas chamber. Despite everything, small acts of resistance persisted. Prisoners sabotaged machines, misassembled munitions, slowed production. In some camps, workers organized covert networks to share food or information. Sabotage was dangerous. Guards punished entire groups for individual acts, but it provided a sense of dignity, however fleeting. To ruin a bullet or weaken a rocket was to strike back, however faintly, against the system. As the war turned against Germany, the camps grew even harsher. Food shortages worsened. Guards, fearing Allied advances, drove prisoners to complete frantic projects: fortifications, railways, weapons. In 1944 and 1945, death marches began. Prisoners were forced to march long distances from camps near the front to those deeper within Germany. Without food or shelter, thousands collapsed on the roadside, shot where they fell. Labor camps that had once consumed lives through work now consumed them. Through marches, the forgotten nature of these camps lies not in their insignificance, but in their banality. They were everywhere, ordinary, woven into the fabric of occupied Europe. They lacked the singular horror of Auschwitz, but shared its logic: to reduce human beings to tools, then discard them. Their absence from popular memory reflects the difficulty of memorializing monotonized the slow deaths, the silent marches, the barracks filled with coughing. And so the question presses itself forward. If history remembers primarily the names of the great camps, what does it mean for the memory of those who perished in the hundreds of smaller sites, whose suffering left almost no trace but silence? As the war dragged into its final years, the forgotten labor camps grew even more brutal. The German war machine, desperate for weapons, fortifications, and raw materials, demanded more output. Yet its human labor for its enslaved prisoners was wasting away. The solution, in the eyes of camp administrators, was not mercy, but replacement. Prisoners, too weak to work, were discarded and replaced with new arrivals. The cycle of attrition accelerated. In many of these camps, records were incomplete. Unlike Auschwitz, which kept meticulous documentation, small camps often had only ledgers of work rosters and meager lists of rations. Many files were destroyed as the war neared its end. Others were never kept in detail at all. The lack of paperwork has left these camps shrouded in silence. Their histories reconstructed only through fragments of testimony. Survivors recalled the final winter of 1945 as the harshest. Middle Badora. Prisoners continued to build V-2 rockets in freezing tunnels while Allied bombs shook the ground above. In Gross Rosen, quarry laborers collapsed on ice-covered rocks, their bare hands bleeding against the stone. In countless smaller sites, men and women staggered through 12-hour shifts with only crusts of bread to sustain them. The hunger, The cold, the exhaustion, these became the weapons that killed silently, visibly, without the spectacle of gas chambers. Asterisk, as Allied forces advanced, the SS began dismantling the camp system. Extermination camps were evacuated, and so too were many labor camps. Prisoners were forced onto death marches, long treks across snow and mud, with no food, no shelter, and no rest. Those who collapsed were shot on the roadside. Columns of skeletal prisoners stretched for miles, winding through German villages. Local civilians saw them pass daily, yet most remained silent, unwilling to risk involvement. These marches claimed tens of thousands of lives in the war's final months. Asterisk. Liberation, when it came, revealed the forgotten camps in scattered glimpses. Allied soldiers stumbled upon barracks filled with corpses, factories littered with discarded uniforms, tunnels clogged with the bodies of workers who had died at their posts. The soldiers expected to find military targets, munitions plants, railways, but instead they found the remnants of enslaved laborers. Some camps were so small, so local, that they barely appeared on Allied maps. Their discovery was accidental, their victims nearly erased before being found. In testimony after the war, survivors struggled to convey the monotony of these places. Unlike Auschwitz, where the crematoria dominated memory, labor camps were remembered for their grayness, their endless repetition of hunger and work. Survivors spoke of carrying stones until their backs broke, of standing in roll calls that lasted hours, of falling asleep on wooden planks with lice biting through their clothes. Death was not sudden, but gradual, a daily erosion of strength. For decades, these stories remained in the shadows. Memorials were built at Auschwitz, Treblinka, Majdanek, places where numbers were vast and horrors undeniable. The smaller camps received less attention. Many sites were repurposed, quarries reopened, factories rebuilt, forests regrown. In some cases, no markers stand at all. Fields covered the ground where prisoners once collapsed. Roads pass over the sites of barracks. The silence of these landscapes conceals what they once held. Historians have worked painstakingly to recover these forgotten stories. Archives in Germany and Eastern Europe contain fragments, transport orders, company contracts, survivor testimonies. Together, they revealed the vast scope of the labor camp system, over 40,000 sites across occupied Europe, from Norway's icy coasts to Greece's rocky hills. Few of these names are remembered. Most slip into obscurity, yet their existence proves how deeply the machinery of forced labor has penetrated everyday life. The labor camps also force us to confront the complicity of industry. German corporations profited directly from slave labor, paying the SS for workers who cost them nothing in wages. Business executives signed contracts, filed invoices, and balanced ledgers, all while knowing the conditions under which their workforce lived and died. After the war, many of these companies survived, rebuilt, and continued to thrive, while the memory of those who perished in their factories remained buried. For survivors, the memory of the camps lived on in subtle ways. Some never spoke of them, feeling their suffering was overshadowed by those who endured Auschwitz or Bergen-Belsen. Kala told their stories late in life, recalling the endless monotony of work, the taste of camp bread, the sound of boots on gravel at dawn. Their memories emphasized the ordinary cruelty of these places, the fact that death came not in dramatic fashion, but in daily exhaustion. And perhaps it's what makes the forgotten camps so haunting. They lacked spectacle, really lacked notoriety. Their horror lay in their banality, the fact that thousands of men and women were worked to death in places no one remembers. Their suffering hidden behind the facade of ordinary industries. Their anonymity mirrors the bureaucratic paperwork that condemned them, efficient, forgettable, and devastatingly effective. Today, efforts are being made to mark these sites. Small memorials stand in quarries, in forests, beside factories. Plaques list the names of towns once home to camps. Museums document the industrial partnerships that sustained the system. Yet, many sites remain unmarked, their history unknown to those who live nearby. The silence persists, as though the land itself swallowed the memory. And so, the question endures: if entire camps can vanish from memory of suffering, on such a scale, can be forgotten, what does that say about how fragile remembrance is, and how easily silence can become the final erasure? Asterisk: in times of war, children should be sheltered, protected, and kept far from the reach of violence. Yet, during the Holocaust, countless children were forced instead into silence, concealment, and stillness. For them, survival meant vanishing from sight. It meant living not in open fields or playgrounds, but in attics, cellars, barns, and closets. The sound of a single cough, a dropped toy, or a whispered word could bring death. The story of children in hiding is not always one of dramatic escapes or daring rescues. More often, it is a story of boredom, of silence, of days and nights that stretched endlessly within small spaces. These children grew up behind walls, watching the world through cracks, waiting for footsteps to pass. Their childhoods were measured not by school terms or birthdays, but by the rhythm of hiding. Families went underground in many ways. In occupied Poland, some hid in the attics of sympathetic neighbors. In the Netherlands, children were concealed in barns or hidden rooms, in Frank's diary being only the most famous example of a phenomenon that touched thousands. In Belgium and France, Catholic convents took in Jewish children, disguising them as orphans. In rural villages, farmers hid children in haylofts or beneath floorboards. Each hiding place was unique, improvised, and precarious. The conditions of hiding were suffocating. In small attics, children crouched in silence for hours, forbidden to move. Even the sound of shifting on wooden boards might alert neighbors or patrols. Food was scarce, smuggled in by those brave enough to assist. Hygiene was nearly impossible. Insects infested the spaces, and illness spread easily. Yet, the greatest weight was not hunger, but silence. Silence became discipline. Parents taught their children not to cry, not to cough, not to sneeze. Toddlers were trained to hold back laughter, to stay still even when restless. Older children read in whispers, if they had books. Many had no toys at all. Imagination became their only plaything, exercised in the privacy of their minds. Some scratched drawings onto walls, leaving traces that would only be discovered decades later. The fear was constant. Patrols searched houses, barns, and attics. Neighbors could betray families for rewards of money or food. At any moment, a hiding place could be exposed. Diaries from survivors describe the terror of hearing boots on the stairs, voices outside, or dogs sniffing near hiding places. Children clung to their parents, their small bodies rigid with fear, as silence became their shield. And yet, within these cramped spaces, life continued. Families marked holidays with whispered prayers, lighting candles hidden from windows. Mothers told stories in hushed tones, weaving fairy tales to distract from the terror. Fathers recited lessons, teaching arithmetic or spelling without books. In hiding, education continued, not in classrooms, but in whispers, passed from parent to child in the dim light of concealed rooms. Helpers, the non-Jews, who risked their lives to hide children, played a crucial role. Some were neighbors who offered their attics. Others were strangers moved by conscience. Priests and nuns sheltered children in convents, often baptizing them under false names. Farmers built false walls in barns, constructing hiding places behind stacks of hay. These helpers faced immense risk. If discovered, they too could be executed. Okay. Their bravery, often quiet and unrecorded, saved thousands of lives. But hiding was not salvation for all. Many children did not survive. Some were discovered during searches, dragged from their hiding places, and deported. Others died from disease, hunger, or accidents while concealed. The fragility of their existence meant that even small mishaps could be fatal. A sneeze in the wrong moment, a neighbor's suspicion, a betrayal for Fudal could end a life. The psychological toll was immense. Children grew up with the constant fear of discovery. Many carried the habits of silence long after the war ended, hesitating to speak loudly, shying away from open spaces, mistrusting strangers. Their childhoods, shaped by fear and concealment, left scars, invisible but deep. And yet, diaries and testimonies show resilience. Some children found ways to create normalcy, even in hiding. They invented imaginary games, sang songs in whispers, or carved shapes into the wooden beams above them. Okay. In their silence, they carried the determination to remain alive, to hold on to a future they could not yet see. The story of children in hiding is not only about suffering, it is also about endurance. It shows how the smallest acts of stillness became strategies of survival. How silence became a weapon as powerful as resistance. But as we think of these children crouched in attics, lying under floorboards, breathing shallowly to avoid discovery, we cannot help but ask, how long could a childhood endure in silence before it ceased to be a childhood at all? For children in hiding, time was an enemy. Hours stretched endlessly in confined spaces where nothing seemed to change. Outside, the seasons shifted, snow fell, leaves sprouted, flowers bloomed, but hidden children often saw none of it. There, worlds were reduced to a single attic, a cellar corner, or the narrow space between walls. Childhood, usually marked by play, growth, and discovery, became instead a waiting game, measured by silence and stillness. Anne Frank's diary captures the monotony of this existence, but hers was only one among thousands. Many children left no written trace. They endured years of hiding with no outlet for their voices. Survivors later described how silence became second nature. Even when the danger passed, they struggled to laugh freely, to cry loudly, to speak without hesitation. Silence clung to them long after the war. In rural villages, children hidden in barns or cellars experienced another form of monotony. They watched daylight through cracks in boards, listened to the muffled sounds of farm work, and smelled the hay or soil around them. They knew the world only through fragments, through the conversations of adults above them, through footsteps echoing on floors, through glimpses of sky seen when hiding places were opened. These fragments became their connection to life outside, reminders of a world they could not enter. The helpers who sheltered them lived in constant fear. A single mistaken child crying at the wrong moment, a neighbor noticing unusual movements could bring disaster. Some helpers devised strict routines. Children were allowed to move only at certain times, to whisper only after dark. Others taught children to pray or sing softly, blending their voices with the rhythms of the household. Creativity became survival strategy. Food was always scarce. Hidden children often survived on scraps, potatoes, bread crusts, bowls of thin soup. Meals were eaten quickly and quietly. In some hiding places, children were fed last after adults had eaten, their hunger treated as something to be endured. Yet many helpers sacrificed their own portions to feed the children they protected, knowing that keeping them alive was worth every risk. Illness was especially dangerous. A child with a cough could endanger everyone. Parents taught children to stifle sneezes, to hold back coughs, to control their bodies in ways far beyond their years. Fevers, infections, or wounds could not be treated openly. Medicines had to be smuggled in secretly, often in small doses. Many children endured untreated illnesses, their suffering compounded by the fear of being discovered if they cried out. And yet, within these confines, resilience blossomed. Survivors describe how stories and imagination filled the silence. Parents told tales of forests and castles, of heroes and magical creatures, spinning narratives to distract from hunger. Children invented games with pebbles, buttons, or scraps of paper. They recited poetry, drew pictures on walls, or whispered lessons from memory. In the absence of normal childhood, they created new forms of it, however fragile. Religious rituals also provided continuity. Jewish families in hiding observed holidays as best they could. A single candle lit in secret on Hanukkah, a whispered blessing over bread on Sabbath. A quiet prayer spoken before sleep. These acts connected children to traditions larger than their confinement. For some, hidden in convents or Catholic homes, survival required adopting Christian practices. Children learned new prayers, attended Mass in disguise, and carried rosaries they barely understood. Many lived with divided identities, torn between the faith of their families and the practices of their protectors. The emotional burden of secrecy was immense. Children were told never to reveal their real names, never to admit they were Jewish, never to trust strangers. They lived with a constant awareness that a slip of the tongue could betray them. For some, the deception became second nature. Years later, even as adults, they struggled with their identities, unsure whether they belonged to the families who had hidden them, the religion they had adopted, or the community they had lost. Some children hid alone, separated from their parents. Their families, unable to protect them, placed them with strangers in the hope that they would survive. These separations were wrenching. Mothers whispered final words. Fathers kissed their children goodbye, never knowing if they would meet again. Children grew up with new families, calling strangers Mama and Papa, while carrying faint memories of the parents they had lost. In urban hiding places, the danger was constant. German patrols searched houses, basements, and attics. Children crouched in silence as boots echoed on staircases. Survivors recall holding their breath, their hearts pounding as dogs sniffed nearby. Even after patrols left, the fear lingered. Silence became so deeply ingrained that children sometimes whispered even when alone, unable to shake the habit of secrecy. Despite the terror, some helpers succeeded in hiding children throughout the war. Entire networks formed, especially in countries like the Netherlands, Belgium, and France. Resistance groups forged false documents, arranged safe houses, and transported children between hiding places. Each movement was fraught with risk, yet thousands of children survived through these networks. Their survival was not due to chance, but to the courage of ordinary people who chose to protect them. And yet, countless others did not survive. Betrayal was common. Some neighbors informed authorities, seeking rewards. Others grew suspicious of unusual activity. When hiding places were discovered, children were often deported alongside their families. Their silence, their patience, their endurance, none of it could shield them from betrayal. The story of children in hiding reveals a paradox. They lived in silence, invisible and forgotten. Yet their survival depended on networks of noise and action outside the footsteps of helpers, the whispers of resistance, the courage of those who moved in the open. Their survival was both deeply hidden and quietly public, balancing between secrecy and solidarity. And so the question arises, if a childhood was spent in silence, without laughter in open fields or shouts in playgrounds, what did it mean to be a child at all in the shadow of hiding? Asterisk, by 1944, the hidden children of Europe had lived in silence for years. For some, their hiding places became the only homes they remembered. A dark attic, a damp cellar, a false wall behind a cupboard, these were the landscapes of their childhood. They learned to measure time not by calendars, but by the footsteps of helpers, the arrival of food scraps, the changing sounds of the world beyond the walls. Liberation came unevenly. In France and Belgium, advancing Allied troops freed villages, where hidden children emerged pale and thin from barns and convents. In the Netherlands and Poland, some children were discovered too late, betrayed in the final months of the war. For others, liberation meant the sudden collapse of silence, the doors flung open. The voices of strangers speaking languages they did not understand, the shock of being seen again. The end of hiding did not bring immediate joy. Many children discovered that their parents had not survived. They emerged to a world of absence, where families were missing, communities destroyed, and homes gone. Some were reclaimed by distant relatives. Others were left in the care of the families who had hidden them. Identity became complicated. Were they the children of the parents they remembered faintly, or of the strangers who had protected them for years? Psychological scars endured. Survivors recalled their inability to speak freely after the war, their instinct to whisper even when no danger threatened. Some could not bear open spaces, clinging to corners and walls. Others mistrusted strangers, conditioned by years of secrecy. Many carried guilt for surviving when others did not. Guilt for having forgotten the faces of their parents. Guilt for moments when their silence could not save those around them. Yet, within these scars lay resilience. Hidden children grew into adults who carried memory forward. Some spoke publicly, recording their stories for future generations. Others remained quiet, their memories too painful to voice. But collectively, their existence testified to both the cruelty of persecution and the courage of survival. The role of helpers cannot be overlooked. Without them, few hidden children would have survived. Neighbors, farmers, priests, nuns, resistance, fighters all risked their lives to shelter children. Some were caught and executed for their efforts. Others lived in anonymity, never celebrated for their bravery. Their choices, often made in moments of moral clarity, saved lives at immense personal cost. At the same time, betrayal was a constant shadow. Entire families were exposed because a neighbor noticed unusual movements, or because someone sought rewards offered by authorities. These betrayals deepened the trauma, teaching children that trust could be as dangerous as silence. In the decades after the war, the stories of hidden children gained recognition. Historians documented their experiences, and organizations of survivors formed. Memorials and museums dedicated spaces to their stories, emphasizing not only their suffering, but also the courage of those who saved them. The story of Anne Frank became symbolic, but it was never unique, only one voice among thousands who endured silence. The lessons of hiding extend beyond the Holocaust itself. They remind us that survival can depend on small acts: a child holding back a cough, a farmer offering shelter, a stranger passing food through a crack. They remind us that courage is often quiet, unseen, and unrecorded. And they remind us of the fragility of childhood, how easily it can be reshaped by fear and confinement. Today, when we think of hidden children, we imagine their silence, the weight of it, the discipline of it, the cost of it. Silence that saved them, silence that scarred them, silence that still echoes in their memories. And perhaps the most haunting question remains: if a childhood passes in hiding, if laughter is suppressed and voices muted, what does it mean to reclaim that lost childhood when silence is no longer necessary? Asterisk in the ghettos of occupied Europe, where food was scarce, disease rampant, and death a daily presence. Survival might seem to have been only about bread, water, and warmth. And yet, within those walls, people risked their lives, not just for food, but for books, in an environment designed to strip them of dignity and reduce them to bare existence. Reading and learning became acts of quiet defiance. The Nazis sought to erase Jewish culture, language, and identity. Books, with their words and stories, were targeted as dangerous. Libraries were looted, synagogues burned, schools shut down. Possessing certain texts became a crime. And yet, inside ghettos like Warsaw and Vilna, secret libraries sprang into being. They were not grand institutions with polished shelves, but collections of smuggled volumes, hidden beneath floorboards, passed hand to hand in silence. In Warsaw, one of the most remarkable examples was the reshaped archive, led by historian Emanuel Ringelblum. Though not a library in the traditional sense, it was a repository of knowledge, preserving newspapers, diaries, essays, and reports from daily ghetto life. Ringelblum and his collaborators collected thousands of documents, burying them in milk cans and metal boxes to outlast the war. Their work was dangerous, punishable by death. If discovered dead, they understood that memory itself was worth preserving. Even if they did not survive, in Vilna, known before the war as the Jerusalem of Lithuania, libraries were dismantled by German authorities. Jewish intellectuals salvaged what they could. Books were smuggled into ghettos in bundles, hidden beneath coats, or tucked into sacks of food. In secret rooms, teachers read aloud to children from poetry and history, reminding them that there was a world beyond hunger. The libraries took many forms. Some were organized collections with catalogs and lending systems. Others were small, stashes of a few books passed quietly among friends. There were novels, poetry, prayer books, scientific texts, even children's stories. People read whatever they could find. A novel could distract from the monotony of hunger. A religious text could offer comfort. A history book could remind them of continuity, that their suffering was part of a longer story. For children, these books were lifelines. In secret schools, teachers read from textbooks that had been smuggled in. Arithmetic lessons, geography, literature subjects that might seem unimportant in the face of starvation were taught with devotion. Parents wanted their children not only to survive physically, but to remain human, to remember they were more than their hunger. A child learning multiplication tables in a secret classroom was an act of hope. The very act of reading was dangerous. German patrols raided ghettos, confiscating contraband. Books, especially in Yiddish or Hebrew, were suspect. Readers risked imprisonment or execution, yet the risks did not stop them. Diaries from ghetto residents describe evenings spent huddled around a single candle, reading aloud while the sounds of boots echoed outside. The flame of knowledge, however faint, refused to go out. Cultural resistance grew from these small acts. Poets composed verses in secret, their words copied into notebooks or memorized by listeners. Musicians wrote songs inspired by books, or history plays were performed in hidden rooms, with scripts passed hand to hand. Libraries fed this cultural life, providing the words and ideas that sustained it. But libraries were not only about literature. They were also about information. Newspapers, both official and underground, circulated in ghettos. Secret presses produced bulletins, smuggled in news from outside, and reported on deportations, battles, and international politics. Knowledge was survival. Knowing what was happening beyond the walls gave people context, direction, and, sometimes, hope. The librarians themselves, softened volunteers, took immense risks. They organized books, tracked who borrowed them, and kept records hidden. In Warsaw, some disguised their libraries as official institutions, securing German permits for educational activities while secretly circulating banned texts. Others simply relied on trust, lending books quietly from apartment to apartment. Why? In a world of starvation, did books matter so much? Survivors later explained it simply. Books made them feel human. They reminded them of a world where beauty, knowledge, and imagination still existed. They gave meaning to days otherwise defined by hunger and fear. A single book could transport a reader beyond the walls, even if only in thought. The Nazis tried to reduce Jews to numbers, 2 bodies marked for labor or death. The libraries fought back by affirming individuality, imagination, and memory. They declared, silently but powerfully, that life was more than survival. And yet, one cannot help but wonder, in a place where bread was rarer than gold, why did so many risk their lives for words on a page? What strength did they find in those fragile books? And what traces of that strength linger still in the memory of those who read in silence? Asterisk, in the ghettos of occupied Europe, where food was scarce, disease rampant, and death a daily presence, survival might seem to have been only about bread, water, and warmth. And yet, within those walls, people risked their lives not just for food, but for books, in an environment designed to strip them of dignity and reduce them to bare existence. Reading and learning became acts of quiet defiance. The Nazis sought to erase Jewish culture, language, and identity. Books, with their words and stories, were targeted as dangerous. Libraries were looted, synagogues burned, schools shut down. Possessing certain texts became a crime. And yet, inside ghettos like Warsaw and Vilna, secret libraries sprang into being. They were not grand institutions with polished shelves, but collections of smuggled volumes, hidden beneath floorboards, passed hand to hand in silence. In Warsaw, one of the most remarkable examples was the reshaped archive, led by historian Emanuel Ringelblum. Though not a library in the traditional sense, it was a repository of knowledge, preserving newspapers, diaries, essays, and reports from daily ghetto life. Ringelblum and his collaborators collected thousands of documents, burying them in milk cans and metal boxes to outlast the war. Their work was dangerous, punishable by death. If discovered dead, they understood that memory itself was worth preserving. Even if they did not survive, in Vilna, known before the war as the Jerusalem of Lithuania, libraries were dismantled by German authorities. Jewish intellectuals salvaged what they could. Books were smuggled into ghettos in bundles, hidden beneath coats or tucked into sacks of food. In secret rooms, teachers read aloud to children from poetry and history, reminding them that there was a world beyond hunger. The libraries took many forms. Some were organized collections with catalogs and lending systems. Others were small, stashes of a few books passed quietly among friends. There were novels, poetry, prayer books, scientific texts, even children's stories. People read whatever they could find. A novel could distract from the monotony of hunger. A religious text could offer comfort. A history book could remind them of continuity, that their suffering was part of a longer story. For children, these books were lifelines. In secret schools, teachers read from textbooks that had been smuggled in. Arithmetic lessons, geography, literature subjects that might seem unimportant in the face of starvation were taught with devotion. Parents wanted their children not only to survive physically, but to remain human, to remember they were more than their hunger. A child learning multiplication tables in a secret classroom was an act of hope. The very act of reading was dangerous. German patrols raided ghettos, confiscating contraband. Books, especially in Yiddish or Hebrew, were suspect. Readers risked imprisonment or execution, yet the risks did not stop them. Diaries from ghetto residents describe evenings spent huddled around a single candle, reading aloud while the sounds of boots echoed outside. The flame of knowledge, however faint, refused to go out. Cultural resistance grew from these small acts. Poets composed verses in secret, their words copied into notebooks or memorized by listeners. Musicians wrote songs inspired by books, or history plays were performed in hidden rooms, with scripts passed hand to hand. Libraries fed this cultural life, providing the words and ideas that sustained it. But libraries were not only about literature, they were also. By the final years of the war, the ghettos had been decimated by deportations, starvation, and disease. Many of the secret libraries were dismantled, their books burned, their readers deported to camps. Yet, even as destruction closed in, the impulse to preserve knowledge did not fade. For those who remained, books became both relics and resistance, symbols of a world that still existed within them. Even as the world outside collapsed, the reshaped archive in Warsaw was perhaps the most extraordinary expression of this determination. Emanuel Ringelblum and his collaborators buried thousands of documents, diaries, school essays, ration cards, underground newspapers, even theater programs. They understood that they themselves might not live, but that the record of their existence must. In 1942 and 1943, they sealed these papers in milk cans and metal boxes, hiding them beneath the rubble of the ghetto. Most of the archivists perished in the Holocaust, yet their work survived in earth after the war, giving voice to those who had been silenced. In Vilna, members of the Paper Brigade, a group of Jewish intellectuals forced by the Nazis to sort through looted books, smuggled volumes out of warehouses, and hid them in cellars. They risked their lives to preserve fragments of Jewish culture, convinced that even if they did not survive, the words of their people would. Many of these texts were recovered after the war, now housed in libraries in Israel and the United States. They stand as testimony that words were valued even in the shadow of annihilation. For the children who learned in secret classrooms, the lessons shaped their futures. Some would later recall how reciting poetry in whispers or reading arithmetic problems by candlelight gave them the strength to imagine a future beyond the ghetto. Education, however meager, was a declaration that they were still growing, still alive, still human. Teachers, often themselves starving and ill, continued to instruct as though each lesson could carry children across the abyss. Survivors describe how even a single book could transform existence. A battered novel, passed from hand to hand, became a thread of continuity with life before the war. A prayer book, recited in secret, reconnected families to centuries of tradition. A textbook reminded them that knowledge still mattered, that truth could outlive lies. In testimonies, readers recall entire paragraphs memorized, entire poems learned by heart, because books themselves might not survive, but memory could. The secret libraries also left a moral imprint. They showed that resistance was not only armed uprising or sabotage, but also the preservation of culture. To open a book in a place designed for death was an act of defiance. To teach a child multiplication in a world of starvation was an assertion that tomorrow still existed. To record the details of daily life ration lists, disease outbreaks, family stories was to declare that history would not be erased, even if its witnesses were. After the war, fragments of these efforts surfaced. Milk cans were dug from the ruins of Warsaw. Hidden caches of books were found in Vilna. Survivors testified about secret classrooms and whispered lessons. Yet, many libraries were lost forever, destroyed in deportations or burned in the flames of ghetto liquidations. Their absence speaks as loudly as their presence. Entire collections, entire voices, erased without trace. And yet, the memory of the libraries lingers. They remind us that human beings need more than bread to live. They need stories, memory, and meaning. Even when survival itself was uncertain, people risked everything to keep words alive. Today, museums and archives preserve the remnants. Pages browned by age, books with frayed covers, school essays written and penciled. These fragile artifacts carry the weight of defiance. Visitors read them not only as texts, but as testimonies of resilience. They prove that even in ghettos, where every day was shadowed by death, there was still a hunger for words as deep as the hunger for food. The secret libraries of the ghettos were never vast. They held no marble halls, no towering shelves, no ornate catalogs. They were small, fragile, often hidden in boxes beneath floorboards. Yet their significance was immense. It's carried memory across the abyss. We spurred humanity in the silence of oppression. And the lingering question they leave us is this: if people risked their lives for books in a world where bread itself was rare,